Hey guys, please turn up the volume. It's literally 4 o'clock in the morning and I don't want to wake anybody up. But I read an article in the Christian Post last night and I fell asleep thinking and praying about it. And I woke up thinking and praying about it. And before I leave to work, I wanted to talk about it. So in 1996, America's Most Wanted featured a youth pastor, a married youth pastor named Chuck Adair, 34 years old, and he was wanted because he kidnapped one of his members of his youth group, a 15-year-old girl. Thanks to America's Most Wanted, he was caught 11 days later in a Las Vegas motel. His wife divorced him, and he went to prison. He was sentenced to 10 years. He only did 9.5. He admitted the girl came to his youth group when she was 13, and that's when he began grooming her. He groomed her for about a year before he started having sex with her at 14. And then by 15, this girl thought they were in love and willingly went with him. While he was in prison, when the girl turned 18, they got married. 2 years later, while he was still in prison, that girl divorced him. He gets out of prison. He has to register as a lifetime sex offender. He gets remarried for a third time, starts preaching. Today, he is a teaching pastor. You know, the tons of pastors at these churches. A teaching pastor at Watermark Church in Dallas, Texas. I don't know how many members, but they say they have over 9,000 in attendance every week. He's also a pastor, a preaching minister at Grace Place in Duncanville, Texas. I actually went on both of their website, and on the Grace Place, there's only two pastors. There's about 100 literally at the other one, but there's only two, and he's one of them. And at Grace Place, and you can click on the sermons, and all the sermons were him. I watched one, which was grueling. It was 43 minutes of basic cliches, stories about himself, and literally, I'd say out of 43 minutes, 1 minute of Bible. He read one scripture verse, which he wrecked. He needs to learn how to exegete, but he probably won't because he's been a pastor preaching for 40 years. And I just contrasted that with our young priest, Father Mike in my church. He's 28 years old, been ordained less than 6 months, and gave the most powerful homily this past Sunday. And he's only, like I said, he's only been preaching 6 months. And in his 10-minute homily, he used 100 times more scripture than this guy. And basically, he called out sin. Imagine that. Imagine that. A man of God calling out sin. And he called out our sin of doing our will instead of God's will. And he said, this is how transgenderism, the sin of transgenderism, happens, because you're deciding who you want to be rather than discovering who God made you to be. And, imagine that, a church whose leader, Pope Francis, called transgenderism demonic. Imagine that. I can't imagine it in these mega churches even touching on that subject, to be honest. But you might wonder how he's a pastor at two churches. He's not the lead pastor. Like I said, all these churches have multiple pastors. Seemed like he might be the lead pastor in Grace Place, because they only have two, but he's the only one I've seen sermons of on the, if you scroll down, all the sermons are all his. But I had Keith Nestor on this channel last year, and awesome dude. If you never heard of him, check him out. Great channel. He was a Methodist minister for 20 years, and there was a time he said that he was a Methodist minister. He was preaching at an Evangelical free church and preaching at an Assemblies of God church. So he was preaching at 3 churches. So they do this. The Watermark Church commented, Christian Post reached out to him, and they said, yeah, they know about his past, so they don't allow him to deal with minors. Now, I always hear this when I call out these false teachers. Oh, you don't understand grace. God can forgive you for everything. Well, if you don't think I don't understand grace, you haven't watched my channel. I'm actually surprised I haven't gotten accused of teaching antinomianism, to be honest. I understand grace. And yes, no matter where you are today, God can forgive you. There is no sin that God cannot forgive, and there is no sinner that God cannot restore and give back to you the years the locusts have eaten, can create in you a new creation. But both of these churches claim their final authority is the Bible. And there's no way you can get around it that this man is disqualified from being a pastor. You know, when I got in the Navy, I got a job with this little Christian company. The guy was teaching me how to fix copiers. And then he said to me, you know, I see you with customers. I think you need to be in sales. And this guy was a self-made man, phenomenal salesman. And he gave me on-the-job training to be a salesman. And I became pretty good at it. And when I moved to Florida, I went for a job for a salesman. And I gave my spiel why I think, you know, he should hire me. And the guy was like, that was phenomenal. Man, you could give a seminar to my team. That was phenomenal. So I'm thinking I got the job. And he says, but there's only one problem. I don't see here a college degree. Did you go to college? And I said, no, sir. When I got out of high school, I had a choice. I could go to 4 years of college, or I could serve my country for 4 years. I chose to serve my country in the United States Navy. He said, that's awesome. Thank you for your service, but you're not qualified. And I didn't get the job. So instead I got a CDL, drove a truck, and then I figured out how I could be a driver salesman. And I love it. It's called DSD. So yes, this man can be forgiven. He can be restored. But according to the Bible, he cannot be a pastor. And it's amazing how far the evangelical churches have fallen. You know, I was an evangelical Protestant for 30 years. And I remember in the 90s, the big scandal was Pastor Charles Stanley separated from his wife. And even his son, Andy Stanley, he's a mega church pastor now himself, said his dad needs to resign. And they had a big feud, and thankfully they reconciled them, because I believe they're both good guys, and they reconciled before Charles Stanley died. But Charles Stanley said, well, we're just separated. If I get divorced, I'll resign. You know, because he was a big kahuna. He was president of the Southern Baptist Convention in the 80s. And in the 90s, he was like the biggest televangelist on TV. You know, he was what we call a Baptist-costal. He was a Baptist, but believed in the charismatic gifts. And then in 2000, he gets divorced and he doesn't resign. So people are going crazy. This is like scandalous. And he never resigned, but he never remarried. And that was what the Southern Baptist Convention said, well, you know, he didn't resign, so it's cool. Or that's what his church said, actually. It was up to his church if they fired him or kept him. So that's what the church said. But we've gone so far from there. Here's a guy who raped a girl, and they're saying he's qualified to be a pastor. Never mind being married and divorced 3 times. I mean, just look up requirements for a pastor in the Bible. And this guy does not meet the requirements. But the church has gotten so far away from the truth, these evangelical churches, you know. And this is what Russell Moore, the former president of the Southern Baptist Convention, said about his denomination. And they all got the same mindset in Protestantism these days. He said they're going through a huge sex abuse crisis right now. He said their sex abuse crisis is a theological problem. And nobody understood that. And he said, well, you know, Pope Francis just laicized, basically defrocked McCarrick because he's a homosexual. He said, we don't have that authority. There's nobody in the Southern Baptist Convention, even the president. I'm the president. I can't defrock anybody. We don't have this authority. Each little church makes their decision if they're going to fire or hire, and nobody can interfere with each church that's in the Southern Baptist Convention. He said, I was disgusted to find a list of over 700 pastors that are still active preaching, pastoring churches today that are guilty of sex abuse. And over 100, this is Russell Moore, the president, this is why he resigned. And they hide them, they move them around, they hide them. And over 100 of them are youth pastors. And ironically, 25% of them are youth pastors, and over 100 of them are in Texas. So where this guy, Chuck Adair, preaches. Just thought that was kind of ironic. Over 100 youth pastors doesn't surprise me, because that's where the predators go, where the youth are. But Russell Moore resigned from the Southern Baptist Convention. He said he's not even a Baptist anymore. I don't know what he is, but he said he can't deal with this sick corruption. And years before that, one of the best Baptist theologians, a man named Dale Moody, he said the problem with the Baptists is you're going to have stuff like this happen. He predicted it. He said because their man-made doctrine, once saved, always saved, refuses to see the biblical teaching that a man of God can fall from grace and fall into total apostasy. So they overlook these sins. They justify these sins because once saved, always saved. And because that was in total contradiction to Southern Baptist theology, he had to resign. This is like their greatest theologian, Bible scholar ever, in modern age, Dale Moody. And the second objection I'll get, well, look at you, Catholic Church. You guys, you're throwing a stone in a glass house. No, we've admitted. We had the worst crisis ever. The 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, this church was in crisis. It started getting better in the 80s and 90s when the spotlight was put on it and the church admitted its fault. And thanks to Pope Francis, he got to the root of the problem. And in 2023, when there were hundreds, I think like 600 allegations against Baptist preachers, and there's only 16 million Southern Baptist 16 million Southern Baptists at the time. Now it's down to 14 million. Like I said, there's a mass exodus. The Catholic Church, with 1.4 billion Catholics, only had 3. You can count them on one finger. 1, 2, 3. Now, before you atheists start condemning all Christians, the secular school system in Chicago in 2023, one city had over 3,000 abuse allegations. So to put things in perspective. But the way Pope Francis dealt with it was, number one, he admitted it. He laicized guys like McCarrick and other priests that were involved. We paid dearly financially, but even more so spiritually. And he confessed that sin. He apologized for the sin. He did whatever he could do in his power to make it better. And then he got to the root of the sin. And he called it what it was, sin. And you don't hear any other denomination saying this. He said the sin was homosexuality. He told his bishops the problem with the child sex abuse was too many homosexuals in the church. He said, if you see a man with a hint of femininity, do not let him in seminary. See, because we believe in grace too. And in the past, if someone said they were same-sex attracted, but they repented from it and they received God's grace and they've changed, we trust them. He says, no, don't trust them. It's too dangerous. The children are too important. The children are too important in the Catholic Church. The children are too important at Watermark and Grace Place Church to allow someone who has this sin. Yes, he can be forgiven, but he doesn't meet the requirements. And there was a magazine, a liberal magazine, said Pope Francis goes full homophobe. That's where I read this article where he said, don't let homosexuals into seminary. But he's not homophobe. He doesn't hate homosexuals. In fact, he's been accused of being too lenient because he said, who am I to judge? And everybody took that out of context. And he was talking about a homosexual who said they're seeking God, they've repented. Can they go to heaven? And he's like, who am I to judge? Someone's repented and is seeking God, whether he's a homosexual or whatever he is, who am I to judge? So, of course, the liberal media flipped it and Pope haters flipped it. But that's what he meant. And, we were able to change. Our crisis is over. Even though there's people that are profiting off of this, still calling it a crisis. In fact, one Catholic guy has a magazine called Crisis. All these YouTubers like, we're in a crisis. No, the greatest crisis was the sex abuse crisis, and it's over. 3 is too many, but the average in the past 10 years has been 3 to 6. 3 to 6, which is way too many, but compare that to the Boy Scouts, to the public school system in a 10-year period, according to Department of Education, there was over 300,000 in the United States public school system. So yes, we defeated the problem because we still call sin sin in the Catholic Church. In 1965, every single Protestant denomination said artificial birth control was sinful. Today, zero says that. The Catholic Church still says that. In 1965, every Protestant denomination said same-sex marriages is sinful. Same-sex unions are sinful. Today, about half of them allow it. Catholic Church still says it's sin. You see, because Watermark Church can trace its lineage to 1999, started by some man. Even the Southern Baptist Convention was started in 1840 because the Southern Baptists were in favor of slavery and the Northern Baptists were against it. So they broke off and started the Southern Baptist Convention, which all the Baptists only started in the 17th century, in the 1600s, by a guy named John Smith, who baptized himself and started the Baptist Church. He was, I think he broke away from the Anglican Church, if I'm not mistaken. The Catholic Church is the only church we can trace our history back to Jesus Christ. And our faith and morals have not changed for 2,000 years. And yes, there's been sinful men. There's been sinful deeds. Jesus said there'll be wheat and weeds in his church. And at the end, he'll separate it. He will separate it. And he's already cleaning house. You know, I did a video the other day about priests and how he's pruning the branches in the Catholic Church. But like haters of America, they'll point to the past sins of America like slavery. But America is great because we have a great constitution that we were able to fix that sin and elect a black president and re-elect him. You know, so the Catholic Church made some mistakes, but because it's the church that Jesus started 2,000 years ago, and he promised that the gates of hell will not prevail against his church, we haven't changed a single doctrine or dogma. We've never taught heresy, and our faith and morals have never changed. So if you're tired of all these circuses in evangelicalism, come home to the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. If you are Catholic, stay Catholic. Got to go to work.